the second Sicha to Mishpatim in Chelek to Zayin. The text we're using is the Lashon Kodesh translation of the Sicha, as it's provided by Project Likkutei Sichos. You can find it on the website. It's advisable to have open a Chumash Rashi in the beginning of Pash Mishpatim to enable you to understand better the Sicha. So the Sicha begins like this: Perush al pasuk kisikne v'gemer hetik Rashi min hakosav v'sateves kisikne evet ivri. The beginning of the Pasha, Rashi quotes from the pasuk the words kisikne evet ivri. If you will acquire an evet ivri, upirish, and Rashi translates and explains evet shu ivri, an evet who is a Jew. The evet is a Jew. Or perhaps you might suggest or think that it's not talking about a Jewish slave, but a slave belonging to a Jew, which means an Eved Knani Shalakachte Yisrael, a Knani Eved, which was acquired from a previous Jewish owner. And about this Eved, perhaps the Torah tells us that he should serve you only for 6 years. And Rashi is going to explain why that can't be the pshat. But before Rashi explains why that can't be the pshat, Rashi is clarifying a question that you might ask on this pshat to begin with. Umani mekaimis nachaltem oisom. There's a pasuk later on in Chumash in Pashas Bahar, where it says that when you have a Knani servant, a Knani Eved, you have to hold on to him and keep him as a slave forever. So how can we even think that here it might be talking about a Knani Eved that the Torah says here that after 6 years he goes free? Says Rashi, we could have explained it as follows: that the pasuk is nachaltem oisom, that you have to keep the slave forever. You might have thought that applies only to an Eved Knani which was acquired from a non-Jewish owner. But if you acquire a non-Jewish slave from a previous Jewish owner, then perhaps that is what this pasuk is talking about in Pasha Mishpatim, and this Eved indeed would go out after 6 years. That's what we might have thought. Says Rashi. So Rashi says that can't be the pshat. Talmud loymar. Therefore, it says in pasuk ki mochelacha chicha ivri, where it says later on in Chumash that if a Jew will sell himself as a slave, so that is referring only to a Jewish slave, a Eved Ivri, who goes out after 6 years. But a non-Jewish slave, even if you acquired him from a Jewish owner, he is still a non-Jewish slave, and he will continue to be an Eved also after 6 years. That is this Rashi. So we have to understand a few things. Aleph, first of all, what words of the pasuk is Rashi addressing? Seemingly the words Eved Ivri. That Rashi is clarifying Eved Ivri doesn't mean an Eved belonging to an Ivri, but rather Eved Ivri, the Eved is an Ivri. That is what this Rashi apparently is coming to address. If so, Madua hetek Rashi games hateves kisikne. For what reason did Rashi quote from the pasuk also the words kisikne? Kisikne is not relevant in the Rashi, and we know that Rashi is very medayik. Whenever Rashi quotes certain words from the pasuk in the Dibra Maschil, it is these words that Rashi is addressing. So here we have to understand Rashi should have apparently, seemingly, quoted only the words Evet Ivri and not Kisikne. We can't say that the reason Rashi quotes the words Kisikne also is because these words they help, so to speak, the Pirush Shakosuf Kan Koeh Be'evet Shu Ivri, that it helps clarify this, that it's a slave who is a Jew. And why would we think that the words Kisikne would help that? Pirush Rashi Lahalom Shekisikne Behechrech Medaber Be'ofen Shemachruhu Bezdin. Further on, in the same pasuk, there is a second Dibur HaMaschil Kisikne. After this Rashi, and you look inside the Chumash, you'll see that right after this first Rashi in pasuk base comes another Rashi with the Dibur HaMaschil again Kisikne, only Kisikne, not Kisikne Evet Ivri like the first one. And here Rashi says Lahalom Kishikisikne Behechrech Medaber Be'ofen Shemachruhu Bezdin, that it must be talking about a case where Bezdin sold a Jew as a slave, and that is only possible if we're talking about a Jewish slave. Bezdin is not selling non-Jews as slaves. Bezdin is only selling a Jew if a Jew stole and cannot pay back. So then Bezdin will sell him for a slave to make up for the gneva that he stole. So if the Kisikne means that it's talking about a slave that was sold by Bezdin, then therefore it implies that Evet Ivri must be a Jewish slave and not a slave belonging to a Jew. So Rashi is quoting in the Dibur HaMaschil Kisikne as well, because Kisikne also adds on as a sort of proof for the Pirush that Rashi explains that Evet Ivri means a Jewish slave. Says the Rebbe that we can suggest that. Why not? Sharei Aleph Hechrech Zeshel Rashi Shakos Medaber B'Machru Bezdin. The proof of Rashi in the next Rashi that we're talking about a slave that was sold by Bezdin, Einamat Tevis Kisikne. Rashi is not proving it from the words Kisikne. Elomitzad Yitura Dekra. Rather, Rashi is proving it from the pasuk being extra. It says in Pashas Behar that if your brother will fall on hard times and will sell himself as a slave, so then that type of Jewish slave is already discussed in the Torah over there. So then what is it talking about over here? Says Rashi, that's why here we must say it's talking about a case where Bezdin sold it. So the proof is not from the fact that it says Kisikne. The proof is from the fact that in Pashas Behar, it already talks about the other type of Jewish slave that sells himself as a slave. So therefore, why would Kisikne in the first Rashi help in the understanding that Evet Ivri means a Jewish slave? Beis Aderabe Gam Hechrech Zeh Shemachru Bezdin Mitzad HaPosuk V'chiyom U'Chochicha. Even this proof that how do we know that it's talking about a case that Bezdin sold someone, because there is already a pasuk in Pashas Behar later on in Chumash that's talking about someone selling himself as a slave. The whole proof is from the very fact that we have already established that this pasuk in Pashas Mishpatim is talking about a Jewish slave. But if it could be a non-Jewish slave, so then there's no question. In Pashas Behar, it's talking about a Jewish slave, and here it's talking about a non-Jewish slave. But once Rashi has already established in the first Rashi that Evet Ivri means a Jewish slave, Then comes the second Rashi on this pasuk, where Rashi is addressing what type of Jewish slave. Because in Pashas Behar, it's talking about a Jewish slave who sells himself as a slave. Says Rashi, apparently here it's talking about not a guy selling himself, but when Bezdin sells him. So the entire proof is only possible once we already have established that we're talking about a Jewish slave. And this understanding is also obvious when you look in the order how Rashi presents these two perushim here in this pasuk. First, Rashi explains Evet Ivri, that it means a Jewish slave, and then the next Rashi, he's talking about the Yitul Dikra, that we already have a pasuk about a Jewish slave later on in Pashas Behar. So, but there it's talking about a Jewish slave who sells himself, and Rashi makes a point that here it's talking about one that was sold by Bezdin. So the order is that first we already know that we're talking about a Jewish slave. So we can't say that Rashi is bringing the words kisikna in the Dibra Maschil because kisikna proves that it's a Jewish slave. No, kisikna proves that it's talking about a slave who was sold by Bezdin, and we only know that after we already have established that we're talking about a Jewish slave. So we are back to the original question here. Why does Rashi quote from the pasuk also the word kisikne and not just the words Evet Ivri? Beis Loma talal datenu mikodes svara kazu shepirush Evet Ivri hu avdeshel Ivri. It's a general question. Why would we bichlal think along those lines that it's talking about a slave, a non-Jewish slave, belonging to an Ivri? Why would we think that? That is not the straightforward understanding in the Lashon of Torah. It's much simpler to say Evet Ivri means a Jewish slave. We find this numerous places in Chumash. For example, Gabenar Ivri, the Ko Al Yosef. It says that the Saramashkim, Saraoifim, they were in the pit, in the jail together with Yosef, and then Saramashkim was freed, and Paroi had his dreams, and then he tells Paroi that in jail we had with us a Jewish boy. So he calls him Nar Ivri. V'shomi tonu Nar Ivri. Doesn't mean Nar Shel Ivri. Nar Ivri, a Jewish Nar. So we see that the Ivri term is a description of the word beforehand. Vegam Benach, also in Divrei Hayomim, it says Ule Shushan Eved Mitzri, that Shushan had a Mitzri slave. Sheperushi Eved Shehu Mitzri. Over there also it means a slave who was an Egyptian. Not an Eved of a Mitzri, we're talking about an Eved of Shushan. So again, we see that the term Mitzri is describing what type of Eved. And also we have proof from Chumash and from Tanakh in the other way, that when we want to describe Eved Shel Ivri, that he is an Eved of someone who is an Ivri, the Torah doesn't just use Eved Ivri, Tanakh doesn't use that term, rather the Tanakh will describe it more accurately. Muchach Meloshen HaKosov, there's a pasuk in Shmuel Aleph, Eved le'ish Amaleki, a slave to Ish Amaleki, to an Amaleki man. So if Eved Ivri would mean an Eved belonging to an Ivri, then he would have had to say Eved Shel Ish Ivri or Eved Shel Ivri. Shekashekavonis HaPasuk Hila Avde Shel Amaleki Ein Omer Eved Amaleki Elo Eved Lish Amaleki. That when the pasuk wants to say an Eved of an Amaleki, it doesn't say Eved Amaleki, rather it says Eved Leish Amaleki. So why would Rashi feel the need to clarify that Eved Ivri means a Jewish slave and not a slave that belongs to a Jew? Why would we think that, Bechlal? It doesn't make sense that we should think that. In Chumash, in Tanakh, that's not the style of how Eved Shel Ivri would be called. Now, this question is a question that the Mefarshim already grapple with. Kama Mefarshim kosu, shahava min ha'avd shel Ivri imitzadiu kaloshem kisikne Eved Ivri. Some Mefarshim write that the reason why we might have thought so, that it's talking about an Eved that belongs to a Jew, but it's a non-Jewish person. When you look in the past, what does it say? If you will acquire a slave Ivri, meaning you're acquiring him, he's already a slave. It sounds like the one being acquired already had the Eved status before he was being acquired over here as a slave. That is why we might have thought that Eved Ivri means a slave belonging to an Eved, to an Ivri. That is what some Mefarshim explain. What would have been the Havamin? Why would we think so? Just because the Torah calls him an Eved, you acquire an Eved, meaning he's already an Eved from beforehand. The Rebbe is not satisfied with that. This is not good enough of an explanation. The if that is Rashi's understanding, then Rashi had to start off with that wrong pirush and then negate it. Like this, Yochel Avde Shel Ivri. What he writes later on, he should have started off with that. Perhaps you might think that what it says here in Pasuk Eved Ivri means an Eved, non-Jewish Eved, belonging to an Ivri. For example, that's how Rashi would have had to start his pirush. And then negate it. No, it can't be that. The Muchach Shapirushu Eved Shu Ivri, and then bring the proof that no, it means an Eved that who is a Jewish person. But Rashi doesn't do that. The way Rashi starts off, Kisik Eved Ivri, Eved Shu Ivri. Rashi just puts it down. We're talking about an Eved who is a Jew. Muchach, that style of writing proves that is the first simple reading of the pasuk. Eved Ivri means an Eved who he is an Ivri. And then only after he already had put that down as a simple pshat in pasuk, he then comes with this other svara. Perhaps you might think otherwise. Maybe you might think that it's talking about a non-Jewish Eved belonging to a Jew. So Rashi is negating it. But that is not that would have been our initial understanding. So what the Mefarshim explained that Rashi needs to negate it is because we might have thought that the word Eved implies that he's already an Eved from beforehand, and therefore we're talking about a non-Jewish Eved. The way Rashi presents over here, this entire Pirush does not imply that. It seems from Rashi that the first and simple reading in the Chumash is indeed what the Pshat is, that it's a Jewish Eved, and that is some other reason why Rashi needs to negate the thought that perhaps it's talking about a non-Jewish slave. And then the question is, why would we think that? So back to our original question over here, why would we think that? Why does Rashi have to negate that if that is not the way the Chumash or the Tanakh usually describes such an Eved or such a situation? Gimel, another question. Rashi brings in over here that Rashi had said that we're talking about a Jewish Eved, and now why can't we say that it's a non-Jewish Eved? So Rashi says, first of all, how can I even suggest that? Isn't there a chiyuv in Parshas Behar by Snachaltem that you have to use the slave forever, a non-Jewish slave? This pasuk, the Ben Chomish Lamikra hasn't learned that yet. This is in Parshas Behar, which is almost at the end of Sefer Vayikra. Parshas Mishpatim is beforehand in Chumash. We know that Rashi always will address contradictions when the contradiction comes up. Not in the first place. In the first place, the Ben Chomish Lamikra hadn't learned that yet. So if Rashi wants to negate the svara that here it's talking about a non-Jewish slave, and he brings proof that it says in Pasuk, Kim mochalocha chicha ivri, and chicha ivri means a Jew. So Rashi could have just said that, and the Ben Chomish Lamikra wouldn't be bothered. How can you even say that it says in Parshas Behar v'isnachaltem oisam? He didn't learn that yet. He doesn't know about that. So he wouldn't be bothered by that. So if that would be a contradiction, that contradiction would only come up in Parshas Behar. So Rashi would have to address it over there, but not over here. But nevertheless, we see that Rashi already brings it in over here. Now, over there, Rashi doesn't have to address it bepoyel because there is no contradiction. Because we know now that here it's talking about a Jewish slave, not a non-Jewish slave. But when Rashi wants to say, perhaps here it's talking about a non-Jewish slave, Rashi has no need to clarify how he can even suggest that, and it won't be a contradiction to what it says in Parshas Behar. Parshas Behar is coming to almost at the end of Sefer Vayikra. You can say, look, Rashi took this entire Pirush from the Mechilta, and this is what it says in the Mechilta. So the Rebbe has established already numerous times whatever Rashi brings in his Pirush on the Torah is found and proven from within the Psukim al-Asad in the place where Rashi explains it. Or in combination with something that was already learned in Chumash earlier on, but not other things. So the fact that the Mechilta brings it doesn't mean that Rashi has to bring it. If Rashi brings it, that means here in this pasuk there is something that compels Rashi to write it. Especially, Rashi is not telling us that this is coming from the Mechilta. Now we know that in the Mechilta you can find this, but Rashi sometimes writes, Rashi will cite the source, but usually he doesn't. And when he doesn't, that means that this is not just a quote from the Mechilta, rather Rashi finds whatever the Mechilta says, but Rashi finds that in the Psukim themselves. So the question is, here in the Pasuk, where does this question of Mani Mekayim is Nachaltem Oisam come up from? So everything that Rashi says must somehow fit with the pshat, pashat the pshat in Chumash over here. So the Rabbi explains it. Sometimes, we look at a pasuk and see a whole pasuk, and we get into the details and the definition of the words on the pasuk, and we forget the context and the bigger picture. So the Rebbe is looking at the whole bigger picture over here. Because of La'el Mesuper, earlier in Chumash, we find already in Pashas Boy, Shebitzias Mitzrayim notlu imam b'nei Yisrael ribi klei kesed v'klei zov v'fulu. The Yidden left Mitzrayim with a huge amount of gold and silver. La'achar zeni tosef v'lam oid kesed v'zov v'fulu mi bizas hayom. And then, by Kriyas Yamsuf, bizas hayam, they got even more gold and silver. Moshe repeats Rashi ala posuk v'yasa Moshe. Rashi in Pashas B'Shalach tells us that Moshe had to force the Yidden away from the Yamsuf, la'achar Kriyas Yamsuf. He sion bal korcham. He had to force them away. He had to make them travel against their will. Why? The Mitzrim beautified their chariots and their horses with gold and silver and precious stones. They beautified their horses with those special metal, precious metals. And the Yidden, after Kriyas Yamsuf, they found all this gold and silver by the Yamsuf. To such an extent that what they got from the Yamsuf was even more than what they took out of Mitzrayim originally. Every single Jew saw individually the fulfillment of the promise that Hashem gave to Avraham Avinu that the Yidden will leave Mitzrayim with Rechush Galu. They were extremely rich. In this type of extreme richness, as of Bnei Yisrael by the Jewish people, it was impossible in that time that a Jew should become an Eved. How could somebody become an Eved? Only either because he's so poor and he has no money and he sees no other way out but to sell himself as a slave, or that he steals and then doesn't have money to pay back the Gneva, so Bezin has to sell him. But that wasn't possible at that time in history. When Parashat Mishpatim was first taught, when Moshe Rabbeinu taught Neisol Parashat Mishpatim, it wasn't possible to have an Eved Ivri. It didn't exist. The key when Shepashas Ve'ela Mishpatim Bo Miyad Lacha Matan Teiro Zman Kotz Lacha Tzias Mitzrayim Kriyas Yamsuf. When was this? Like Rashi says in the beginning of the Pasha, Ve'ela Mishpatim, it was after Sinai. Ma Elum Sinai, Elum Sinai. So this was behemshech to Matan Torah, right after Matan Torah. Matan Torah was just a couple of weeks, 6 weeks after Kriyas Yamsuf, and 7 weeks after leaving Mitzrayim. So, Mistaber, Shalachayleresh Amakash Bochel, Bnei Yisrael, Es HaMishpatim HaTzivuim, Eides HaDvarim HaNoigim, Bamitzuyim, Tekev, Beises V'Anu Matziv. It's reasonable to assume that probably HaKadosh Baruch Hu will tell the Yidden the type of mitzvahs that are relevant to them at that time. Kagoin, how do we see that? In the end of Parshas Yisro, after Matan Torah, the Yidden had a major revelation of godliness, and they saw the Merkava, and they saw Malachim, and they saw everything. So then Hashem saw the need that right after Matan Torah to tell them something, and that's in the end of Parshas Yisro, even before Mishpatim. Going, for example, don't make idols out of silver and out of gold. And also the Mizbeach, in the end of Parshas Yisro, Mizbach Adomo, Mizbach avonim tasli. You'll make for me a mizbeach out of earth, out of stone, which is again hainu loy or lav dafke mizbeach kesav v'zov. Because the Yidden were so rich at the time, there was a concern. They might make some type of images out of gold and silver to reflect the Malachim or revelations of the Merkava that they saw at Matan Torah. So Hashem told them, Lo yizasnuiti. And also, you're going to make a mizbeach. Probably you are so rich, you're going to want to make it gold, silver. But I'm telling you, I want to make you to make a mizbeach. Adom, avonim. Although they each had so much gold and silver, Hashem wanted this mizbeach not to be made out of gold or silver. So we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu considered the situation on the ground in what type of mitzvahs he's giving the Bnei Yisrael after Matan Torah. So he gives him then the mitzvah not to make Elekei Kesef Elekei Zov, gives them the mitzvah of Mizbach Avonim Tasali, Mizbach Adomo. So when it comes to Pasha Mishpatim, if we follow this logic, so what kind of mitzvahs will Hashem give us? What kind of Mishpatim? L'chayra Mishpatim that are possible at that time. Lochein, therefore, so we have the pasuk say, Kisikne Eved Ivri. You'll buy an Eved Ivri. So Rashi right away says, Eved Shu Ivri. The pirush, the simple understanding of the word Eved Ivri, of course means an Eved who is an Ivri. Like the Rebbe brought all the proof. Nar Ivri, Leshushan Eved Mitzri. And if it would mean the other thing, then the Torah wouldn't use that term. Rather, it would say Eved Leish Ivri. So yeah, Rashi puts it down right away in the beginning of the Rashi. Eved Shu Ivri. It means an Eved who is a Jew. Hainu shahaloshin Eved Ivri perusha kipshuta Eved Shu Ivri. That's the simple understanding of what this means. Nevertheless, once Rashi had put that down, Rashi still needs to address another issue. Then Rashi says, but you know what? I understand that you might think that that's not possible. An Eved who is an Ivri at that time? Impossible. So that might give you the idea that perhaps here Eved Ivri means something else. An Eved, non-Jewish Eved, Shel Ivri. Perhaps you might think that due not from the Pshata Pasuk, from the wording, it doesn't really fit so well. But you might still think that here there might be an exception. And the reason you might think that is because it's not Shaykh at that time, a Jewish slave. How could that be? Everybody had gold and silver. Mitzad hemshech v'seder aksuvim hasvara mechayeves shemeduva kan be'ad shel ivri Eved knani shelakachtem Yisrael. Considering the bigger picture, you might think that this must be talking about a non-Jewish Eved belonging to a Jew that is being sold from one Jew to another Jew. Kiven shelakol ivri hoya oz chekev la'acha bizas hamitzrayim bizas hayam kanal rechush gadol. Because every Jew had a lot of rechush. The need to negate that pshat. Elo shal kach echel lisera letzel ben chomish lemikra hashaylo. the Rabbi still has a few open questions in the beginning of the Sicha. And one of the questions was, even if Rashi wants to negate this wrong pshat, he feels he has to negate it. So Rashi could have brought up the idea. Maybe you might think it's talking about a non-Jewish slave that belonged to a Jew and is being sold to another Jew. So Rashi can have right away brought the proof that that is not so, because it says and only a chicha ivri, a Jewish slave, goes out by 6 years, and that's it. Why did Rashi have to bring into this discussion? And how could we even think so? Isn't there a mitzvah that you have to use the slave forever? And we had asked, why does Rashi even need to bring that up? That's only later in Parshas Behar. Ben Choshel Mikra doesn't even know about this yet. So the Rebbe is going to explain that with a ge'enische chap over here. It's the Ben Chomish Lemikra has already faced, not the Pasuk in Parshas Behar, that he doesn't know yet. But he knows about the Ovis. He had learned in Chumash about the Ovis. And he knows that the Ovis had non-Jewish slaves. In particular, we know about Eliezer Eved Avram, who certainly was an Eved for many, many years, way more than 6 years. Let's read that inside. The Mecham Shel Mikra could come up with a simple question. You have already learned about Eliezer. He was already in Avram's Reshus before the Bris Ben Absorim. Venishar Eved Avram, Gama Sirius Bishonim Shal Achlezer. Bris Ben Absorim was before the birth of Yitzchak. Decades later, Eliezer was still the servant of Avram. Avram sent him to find a shidduch for Yitzchak. At the time, Yitzchak was 40 years old. That means he was an Eved for way more than 6 years. He became kosher. Considering that Avram kept the entire Torah before it was given. This is not some medrash. Rashi already brought this in Chumash a few times, meaning the Ben Chom Shel Mikra knows this as Pshuta Shel Mikra. The Ovis kept the Torah. Keitzat yitochen shavram hechzik the Eved Knani Eliezer ribu shonim koseh. How could it be that Avram kept a non-Jewish slave for so many years? If we can entertain the idea that perhaps this pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim is talking about a non-Jewish Eved, which it doesn't, but even how can we even entertain that thought process? That's what the question the Ben Chomish is going to have. How can you suggest that the pasuk here, which is followed with the mitzvah that this pasuk base, that if you have an Eved and after 6 years he goes free, if that it would be talking about a non-Jewish slave, how did Avram keep Eliezer for so many years? How come he didn't keep this mitzvah? If it means an Eved belonging to an Ivri. Avram was an Ivri. He had a non-Jewish slave. So Rashi is going to address this question of the Ben Chomish Lemikra. But Rashi is going to make this question even better. Rashi is not asking the question like that, because perhaps there is some reason why Avram kept Eliezer. After all, while Avram kept the entire Torah, but it was still before Matan Torah, and perhaps we can have some explanation why Eliezer is an exception to the rule. Somehow we can answer that. So Rashi doesn't want to just ignore that question. Rashi wants to say, you know what, this question that the Ben Chomesh might come up with, Rashi is going to show the Ben Chomesh how this question is really even a stronger question. This is what compels Rashi to bring in our Pasha, the pasuk from Parshas Behar, Vayis Nachaltem. Elo shebim came to me al hanhogas Avram, but instead of bringing up the wonder about the behavior of Avram, he brings the same contradiction, but with an even stronger argument. Not just how does it fit with Avram's behavior, which might have some other explanation. No, the Rashi tells us what Avram did actually is in line with what the Torah clearly commands. The pasuk says clearly that when you have a non-Jewish slave, you have to keep him forever, and it should be an inheritance for your children. So that's the mitzvah. So Rashi is basically telling the Ben Chomesh Mikra, don't only ask based on the behavior of Avram, which might have some explanation perhaps or not. I'm going to actually teach you something that you haven't learned yet. In Parshas Behar, the Torah actually commands us to keep the non-Jewish slave forever. So therefore the question, how can I even suggest that here the pasuk might mean a non-Jewish slave belonging to a Jew? How does that bichlal fit? Therefore Rashi must explain it, that we might say that over there, the pasuk that you have to keep the slave forever, is talking about a slave that was acquired from a non-Jewish owner. But here, if we would go with the svara that it's talking about a non-Jewish slave, would be talking about a non-Jewish slave that is acquired from a previous Jewish owner. And that is different, and that one is only for 6 years. And therefore, Rashi needs to negate, no, it's not talking about that, it's talking about an Eved Ivri. By Eliezer Avram, it was obviously an Eved acquired from a non-Jew. So that's why Avram kept him forever. We can now also appreciate why Rashi needs to quote from the pasuk not just the words Eved Ivri, but also Kisikne. Because these words actually give added strength to the Pirush. How so? Seemingly, why does the pasuk, forget about Rashi quoting Kisikne, we can really ask on the pasuk itself, why does the pasuk have to write Kisikne Eved Ivri? The words Kisikne are extra. The Torah could have started straight away with the actual halacha. Eved Ivri Sheish Shonim Yaved V'Gomer. A Jewish slave should serve for 6 years. If you're going to acquire an Eved Ivri, he should serve you for 6 years. It doesn't have to say if you'll acquire. Could you just go straight to the point? As we find many times, Aldel Pasha saying, even in this week's Pasha, somebody hits another and kills him. It doesn't give us a backstory that they fought and then he hit him. Sometimes we have that, but there's a reason for it. Why does it have to say Kisikne altogether? Haloshen Kisikne Meir al Pulo Be'osit. The word Kisikne is in the future tense, and it's talking about something that is in the future. In the present, this action does not exist yet. And in our situation, not only is this something in the future and not now, it's something that now would not really be possible. Like we discussed before, at present, when this mitzvah was given, Parashat Mishpatim, it wasn't even shayach. Like we said before, they had so much money, it was unfathomable that a Jew should end up being a slave. So the Torah says kisikne, using the future tense here, not only stam talking about something in the future, because here it has to be something in the future, because right now it's not possible. So that automatically implies that we're talking about an evet ivri, something which wasn't possible at the time. And it can't be talking about an evet knani, avdeshal ivri. If it would be talking about a non-Jewish slave, well, that is something that they already had that. And it was a possibility at the time to have non-Jewish slaves. So therefore, the Torah wouldn't have had to write kisikne. If it would be talking about a non-Jewish slave, the Torah could have right away written Eved Ivri, if it would mean an Eved often Ivri, a non-Jewish Eved, Cheshon, and Yavit for 60. There's no need to bring in the words kisikne. The only reason why the Torah writes kisikne, because we're talking about something which at the time wasn't possible and was only going to be possible many years later. So therefore, the Torah writes kisikne. V'hila moiser. If it would be talking about a non-Jewish slave, it would be extra. Due to their immense affluence and ashirus, they certainly had non-Jewish slaves. Certainly, we cannot say that that was something that wasn't common at the time. So this explains the Rashi so far. However, if we explain it this way, then we are faced with a strange situation. The Torah is starting off Parshas Mishpatim with a mitzvah that wasn't really relevant at the time. So the question is, then why start with such a mitzvah? That's Sifhei. Omnam al pizei nemuvin. Madua be'emes Pesach hakos v'sdina mishpatim take lachman Torah b'din evediv. So why indeed does the Torah start with that halacha? Shahoya os milsud al shchicha klan. Something totally not usual. Why not begin with something which is common and commonplace? Especially considering there is another halacha that really should be written before this halacha. How can we have an Eved Ivri in Parshas Mishpatim? The Torah is talking about, as Rashi says in the second Rashi, about an individual shemachru bezdin. Bezdin sold him. Why did Bezdin sell him? He stole, and he didn't have money to pay back. So didn't have money, so Bezdin sold him as a slave. The din of a ganev is that he has to pay back, not just pay back the thing itself, he has to pay back, depends what it is, double or 4 times or 5 times, a shayr, a seh, which is also in this week's Pasha. And he didn't have that money. Especially considering that this whole situation of Kisikne Eved Ivri has a history beforehand, an action of stealing, Depending on the details of the type of neva, he has to pay 5 times or 4 times or at least 2 times. And then, if he doesn't have the ability to pay, then he's being sold. Hey, Dalet V'Shnayim. So let the Torah, and this is further on in our Pasha. You see in the footnote 32 with the star, Lekamon, Chof Aleph, Lamed Zayin, Chof Beis Gimel. In this week's Pasha, we have these halachas. Somebody stole, he has to pay double, he has to pay 4 times, 5 times, depending on the details. So let the Torah start first with those dinim, which are written later on in the Pasha, and then tell us. And if the guy doesn't have the ability to pay, then Bezdin will sell him as a slave, and then the halachas of the Eved. So why doesn't the Torah start like that? So this is a double question. First of all, why Bichlal start with the story of an Eved Ivri, which is something which at the time after Matan Torah was not really a commonplace situation. It was impossible. And even if you want to start with that, but you got to start it in order. First, write the din. What happens when somebody steals and needs to pay back? What does he have to pay back? And then say the subcategory, and if he doesn't have money to pay, then he has to be sold by a Bezdin, and then he should be a slave for 6 years. The Kiven says that Keshi b'pshuta shel mikro eina moving madua Rashi shem yashav is kol hakushis b'pshuta shel mikro eina metaris kushis u'v'perusha. Now this question is not some sophisticated question. It's a very basic pshuta shel mikro question. Anybody learning Chumash thinks about this. Yeah, this is an obvious question. Now we know the rule that Rashi himself took upon himself the job to address any question that comes up in the simple reading of the Chumash. And when it comes to this question, it doesn't seem like Rashi is addressing this. And not because there aren't answers. We find in the footnote 34, he brings from Even Ezra, Ramban, Ababanel, there are, and others, numerous Mefarshim on Chumash who actually address this question. So their answers might not be the same level of Pshuta Shel Mikra like Rashi, but the question is a simple question, and how come Rashi doesn't address it? And you can't say that according to Pshuta Shel Mikra, that's not a question. And you're going to say, why not? Why isn't this a question? You're going to tell me, because in Pshuta Shel Mikra, the order of the mitzvahs and which mitzvah comes before or after another, there is no necessarily an explanation and a reason or logic that we can understand. And that's why Chumash, oftentimes Rashi doesn't explain why is this mitzvah first, this mitzvah second. So the Rebbe says you can't say that that's why Rashi doesn't have to address it. Why not? Because Sharei Nois of Lad Goshas Rashi the Bereish Pasha Seinu Gufa. Ve'ela Meisval Risheni Mar Risheni Misina Pela Misinai Ve'lomo Nismacha V'chulu. Rashi writes right in the beginning, Pasuk Aleph of this week's Pasha, that this Pasha comes after Matan Torah. And why is this Pasha, Eila Mishpatim, after the end of Pasha's Yisro, where it's talking about the Mizbeach? Because to teach us that the Dayanim, Bezdin has to sit in Lishkas HaGozis, near the Beis HaMikdash, near the Mizbeach. So you see, Rashi does actually address right here this smichus. Especially Al Pi Hanal, besides for this, he Al Pi Hanal had an Inyan Zesh and Nismach HaMitzvus, HaMitzvah Lematzah Bizon HaMitzram Vayom, who has sworn that Kos HaKedaytoch Pirush Rashi Shein HaKavon Sakos V'Levedivri Levedknani. We have just discussed that why is Rashi even bringing up the idea that Eved Ivri might mean an Eved that belongs to an Ivri, but who is a Goy? And the question was, why does Rashi even have to address this if it doesn't really make sense in the wording of Eved Ivri? So we have explained that the reason why Rashi needs to explain it is because we will have a question. How is there Bichlal an Eved Ivri at that time? And that might have caused us to think that it's talking about a non-Jewish Eved who belongs to an Ivri. So in other words, Rashi is taking that factor into consideration. If he's taking that into consideration, then he should also take into consideration to explain to us, so why indeed does the Torah Taka start with that situation, which is not really possible at the time? And if yeah, then it should be brought in order. And also, that's addressing the other point, that you cannot have a situation of kisik nevet ivri without first having the halacha of nimkar b'nevasei, that if an individual stole and he can't pay, then he has to be sold. So the Torah had to first bring the general mitzvahs that are connected to this. So although here in this pasuk, it doesn't look like Rashi directly addresses the answer to this question, but looking further in the psukim here about the Eved Ivri, Rashi is actually answering this. Because Rashi brings that if the Eved says that he wants to continue being an Eved after the 6 years, they pierce his ear. So Rashi says, why the ear? Mikol Shari Varim Shebeguf, from out of all the other body parts. Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai, Eisen Zeis Shomal Hasin Ale Signe, V'holach Begonna of Tirotza. Says Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai that the ear who heard that Matan Torah, don't steal, and nevertheless went and stole, should be pierced. And if it's talking about the other type of Jewish Eved, where the person sells himself as a slave, so over there also, the ear who heard, which heard that Matan Torah, Hashem says that you are servants to me, abodim to Hashem, but this individual went and acquired a master for himself, that ear should be pierced. The explanation how that addresses the question is like this. In general, all over Torah, whenever there's a reward for a mitzvah mentioned, the Torah does not stress where the connection is between the schar, the reward, and the mitzvah itself. Ledugma, for example, last week's pash. In the Mitzvahs Adibris, the mitzvahs kibud abaim, shescharahu laman yarichun yomecha v'geim. The reward is long life. Besides, for the point that the reward is not recognizable immediately after doing the mitzvah, only years later, when the person eventually lives a long life, that's when the reward comes about. Besides for that, in the the reward, by definition, doesn't tell us anything about how is the long life connected to Kibud Av. Why is the schar for Kibud Av O'ein long life? Similarly, when it comes to punishments, we don't see where is there a connection between the punishment of Malchus or Kodes to the specific Avedas for whom one gets these punishments. When it comes to the Nevi Ivri, we see that the Torah does make that link and the reason for the punishment. Where the Torah says that you have to pierce the ear, and the reason being, as Rashi explains simply in Chumash, that this is because the ear heard by Matan Torah something, either Lesignev or Kilibnei Yisrael Avodim, and the ear heard it, but didn't internalize it and didn't follow through with what it heard. In Yiddish, they say, "Hat gehört, but nicht der hört." He heard it, but he didn't follow through with it. So therefore, the ear gets punished and is being pierced. Although that the timing when the piercing happens isn't when the person did the things, either stealing or selling himself as a slave. The piercing happens 6 years later when the person says, I want to continue being an Eved. Says the Rebbe, Mikol Mokim, nevertheless, the punishment why his ear is being pierced is not because he says, I love my master, I love my wife and children, and I want to continue being an Eved. That's not why he's being punished. The punishment, the piercing punishment is given for him stealing, or for the fact that he sold himself for a slave, although he is an Eved Hashem. What is he acquiring? A different master over himself. That's why he's being punished. Take you from Miyat Kashagorim and Nas Eved Ivri, which are things that happened originally when he became an Eved Ivri. Here in the Sicha, the Rebbe does not explain why, meaning if the punishment is for the original thing that the person did, either stealing or selling himself as a slave. So why is it only happening 6 years later? So elsewhere, the Rebbe explained about this more at length, that the initial stealing or selling himself for a slave could have happened due to the person's circumstances in life at the time, where he hit rock bottom, he has no money, so he stole out of desperation. So we can perhaps have Rahmanas on him. So he's not being punished then. But if 6 years later, when he can go free, he decides, I want to continue being an Eved. In other words, he doesn't see something wrong being in that state. So that then shows that when he originally stole and originally sold himself as a slave, it wasn't only an act of desperation, it was a problem in his perception. He looked at things wrongly. He doesn't realize how wrong it is to steal, how wrong it is for a Jew to sell himself as a slave. So that is being revealed when 6 years later, he decides to continue being an Eved. So at that point, he is then being punished for the original point. So in any case, the main point that Rabbi wants to make over here, that the piercing of the ear comes as a punishment for the ear who heard at Matan Torah something and didn't listen, didn't follow through with that. So that explains why this mitzvah was chosen as the first one that the Torah commands us right after Matan Torah. Because by Eved Ivri Nire be'oinchavi be'oifen goliven nikar. Because by an Eved Ivri, in his punishment, it is openly revealed and recognizable, gam begufi agashmi, even in his physical body. Hakesher ben mishpatei Lahar Sinai. The link between the Mishpat and the Har Sinai, Ve'ela Mishpatim, Ma'arishenim is Sinai, Af'elum is Sinai, that the Mishpatim are a hemshech and a link and a connection to Har Sinai is openly seen in the Verotza Oznei. Now, based on the above, Pirush Rashi is in Sheshama v'chulu, Nimtza shechidush ikri bedin eved ivri, hu be'etzem asher lenishma letzive b'Har Sinai. That what is a main chidush in the dinim of eved ivri is the very fact that he did not listen to a command of Har Sinai. V'ilu inyan ein levenimka mitzad gedlat hashlomin. The point that he didn't have money and therefore he was sold, that's already a side point. In this context, that's a side point. We had asked, shouldn't the Torah first write the halachas, what happens if a ganev, and then he should say that if he doesn't have money, then he's being sold, and then he has the din of an Eved Ivri. That's not the reason why it's being sold as an Eved Ivri. It is because the ear didn't listen properly to Har Sinai. And that's why right after Parshas Yisrael, after Matan Torah, comes Mishpatim, Eved Ivri. That is the first Mishpat. And because of that, the Torah puts the din of Eved Ivri in close proximity to Elum Sinai. And where is that alluded to? Where is it hinted? In the punishment of Rotza Oznei. And based on this, there is now an additional explanation that we can appreciate from this. If it would have been a commonplace scenario that a person has an Eved Ivri after Matan Torah, then we might have thought, if that would have been a commonplace thing that people had Eved Ivri situations right after Matan Torah, then we would have said, you know why this is the first halacha? Because it's a common thing. It was relevant. They had to know it. But because at that time in history, the whole idea of an Eved Ivri was only something which will really only come to be relevant in later times, and it was an unusual thing. That fact in itself compels us to say that what is the reason why this is chosen as the first din? Because there must be something unique about Eved Ivri. And what is that unique thing? As we discussed. So that very fact tells us to look for why is then that the mitzvah? If it wasn't a commonplace thing, so then there must be something else going on. And we appreciate that the connection is the link to Har Sinai, the direct open link between this mishpat and that which happened at Har Sinai. Now, when we look at this entire situation from the inner dimension perspective, from Pnimius HaTorah, it will be even more geschmack, more sweet. Kiven shekol hamechuven b'tachlis de matan Torah, hu lifeles habirur v'azichuch b'inyone ha'olam al Torah mitzvos. In general, the purpose of matan Torah is to effect a refinement of the world at large through Torah mitzvahs. Mash'enkan Torah mitzvahs shall obviously lifnei matan Torah, shall loipo alushin begashim seilam. The obvious did Torah mitzvahs to before Matan Torah. However, their Torah mitzvahs did not affect a change in the physical world. Lochein horishen mibein hamishpatim shel achar matan Torah hu tzivui v'din kozeh shebein niris begilui pulas matan Torah gam begashmis olam. So therefore, when the Torah now wants to choose what should be the first mishpat to be presented after Matan Torah, it should be such a mishpat where it is openly revealed how it affects the Gashmistic world. And in that context, Eved Ivri is the most fitting. Why? Al dvar gimel hamadreges Eved Knani, Eved Ivri, v'omo Ivriya, v'avedas Hashem b'nefesh ha'adam. In Chassidus, Maimorim of the Mittel Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, we find how the different types of servants, the non-Jewish slave, Eved Knani, the Jewish slave, Eved Ivri, and the Jewish maidservant, Omo Ivriya, symbolize 3 levels of Avodas Hashem. And he's going on to briefly explain those 3 levels, and then we understand why the Eved Ivri really is very fitting to be the first one after Matan Torah. Eved Knani, who Misha Nafshe HaBahamis B'Tokva, who is an Eved Knani type of Oved Hashem? The one whose Nefesh HaBahamis is still in its full strength and power. Avda Befkero Nichalei. It's a term, the Gemara in Gittin uses that term. The Eved wants Hefkerus. He's comfortable with Hefkerus. He wants to live his life without any accountability. He wants to be scot-free. Eved Knani, Avda Befkero Nichalei. Just what? He has no choice. He happens to be an Eved. He has to do what the master tells him. But what he wants, Hefkerus. So he is drawn downwards towards the taivus of this world. But he forces himself to do good because he has that yoke. He's an Eved, he's afraid of the master, whatever it is, he does what he needs to do. Without the analysis, the Eved Ivri is already a higher level type of Eved. The Eved Ivri type is a Yid whose nefesh alekis influences his nefesh habahamis. The midos, the emotions, avas Hashem, yiras Hashem of the nefesh alekis shines, illuminates the nefesh habahamis too. Achigam etla nefesh habahamis yesh no chukol Hashem. The nefesh habahamis itself starts having a desire and is drawn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Elo, Sheteren is hapchol kedusha, but the nefesh habahamis was not yet transformed to kedusha. That he should not have any more desires for the physical world. Al derech Eved hamevi el habayis as kol hitztarchuyos b'nei habayis b'achila b'shtiya, like a slave who brings to the house all types of foods and drinks for the needs of the people in the house. But the food items that he brings are raw material, raw food. If it's wheat or other foods that still need to be processed, they're not yet fitting for human consumption. Why? They were not cooked yet. In other words, they did not yet get changed from their original form. So the nefesh habahamis of the Eved Ivri type of Yid is one who has not yet been fully transformed. Yes, the midas of the Nefesh Elokis already started to affect the Nefesh Bahamis. The Nefesh Bahamis is starting to have some desire for something more spiritual, true kol Hashem. Yet at the same time, the Nefesh Bahamis is not yet transformed. The Nefesh Bahamis still has taivus for Elam Hazeh. The Oma Ivriya, Isha taivus v'amidas, the Nefesh Bahamis, mishapches lekdusha. The Oma Ivriya is already one whose taivus and midas of Nefesh Bahamis have really been transformed to such a degree that the only desire the Nefesh Bahamis now has is godliness. So now we can really appreciate why the beginning of the Mishpatim after Matan Torah, which is meant to symbolize and express the pe'ula of what Matan Torah does to the world. He bedine Eved Ivri starts off the Torah with the dinim of Eved Ivri. The fishe inyan ze Eved Ivri who has cholas haveda b'nei solach Matan Torah, because the Eved Ivri aveda is really what the aveda of a yid after Matan Torah in the world is meant to do, which is lifel b'nefesh bahamis so b'inyono elam bichlal sheishtanu, to affect the nefesh bahamis and the world at large to change. The consul Kedusha, they should enter the realm of Kedusha. Masha'enken ba'aveda David Knani, but David Knani is not mentioned here, because the aveda of David Knani adain ein shum shinui amiti b'mideisav. There is no change in the midas of the nefesh bahamis of the David Knani. He wants Kedus, we said. He does what he has to under force. He has no choice. But there's no effect on the person, on the Nefesh Bahamis, on the Chelek Ba'elam. There is no pe'ula of Matan Torah, and the whole point of Matan Torah is not that something should be superimposed on the world, but the world is not part of it. The whole point is to affect the world. So the Aved of the Eved Knani, there is no change, not in his midas, while that's the Chelek Ba'elam, and also not in the world at large. Dafke Eved Ivri, that is the Aveda where the Nefesh Elokis is starting to affect the Nefesh Bahamis and starting the process to transform it. That's why we start with Eved Ivri. Coming from Matan Torah, what is Matan Torah all about? Go now and affect the Nefesh Bahamis and Chelek Ba'elam. And that's why the Torah starts with Eved Ivri. And once you do that Aveda, you can then mature, graduate, and come to the next level of Aveda. Hemshach Aveda, shemis'aleh ha'odem la'aveda d'Ama Ivriya. The person then gets elevated to Aveda of Ama Ivriya, u'mehapech es hamidus the nefesh bahamis v'inyan elam b'chlal, in which he truly, fully transforms the nefesh bahamis and the world. She'iyu d'irlei yisbarech, that they should really become a deer of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu really is at home, and Eined Milvade. But that's the next hemshech of the Pasha, the dinim of Oma Ivriya. So we start with Eved Ivri, which is the pool of Matan Torah, and we then graduate towards the hemshech of the Pasha that talks about Oma Ivriya.